In 1995, MacArthur Wheeler walked into two Pittsburgh banks and robbed them in broad daylight, with no visible attempt at disguise. He was arrested later that night. Now, how stupid do you have to be to try to rob a bank in broad daylight, with no disguise, in full view of security cameras? This is a true story, by the way. But it turns out that MacArthur Wheeler was actually very smart, because he'd learned about something called invisible ink, which is basically lemon juice. When you use it to write something on paper, you can't see it. But heat the paper up, and the words are revealed. So Wheeler knew, because he was very smart of course, that if he smeared lemon juice on his face, he'd become invisible. He was so sure he was right that he was prepared to risk jail time. And he almost got away with it, right up to the point where he pulled a gun and demanded money, because it turns out that lemon juice doesn't make you invisible. Damn. And it turns out that he wasn't very smart, he just thought he was very smart. But how is it possible that the dumbest people on the planet often think they're the smartest? The reason I know about MacArthur Wheeler is because his deluded sense of his own intelligence was used in a study by Джъстин Крюгер and Дейвид Дънинг, revealing something we now know as the Dънинг-Крюгер effect. The authors measured confidence against competence and discovered that, counterintuitively, the less people knew, the more confident they were in their own abilities. Now, all that was in the original video, and at this point I moved on to a graph illustrating that. But a lot of people pointed out that this was not in Krüger and Dønning's original paper. Thanks, I know that. I have a link to the paper in the video description. The reason I used it is because the graphs from the paper are very boring, and ironically they don't really illustrate what we now know as the Dønning-Krüger effect. I also stressed that what we know as the Dønning-Krüger effect is not to be confused with Krüger and Dønning's paper. As I explained in the video description, there was no mention of the Dønning-Krüger effect in the Krüger and Dønning study. That term was coined and popularized long afterwards to describe the overconfidence of people who gain a small amount of knowledge and think they now know better than the experts. Krüger and Dønning never came up with this principle, it simply bears their name and was inspired by their study. I gave lots of examples of this effect in my video under the banner of Do Your Own Research, which is what comes next as we go back to the original video. You can see why MacArthur Wheeler's experience is an example of how the exhortation to do your own research can have unintended consequences. I mentioned the problems of do your own research before and got these responses. Isn't doing your own research science? Science is based on it. After all, Galileo did his own research. Well, that's certainly doing research, which is fine. Doing research is what science researchers do. But what do people mean when they talk about doing your own research? I went back over the last 20 years to see how the term has been used on the internet. Nearly all the early results, up to about 2008, were academic websites referring to autonomy in choosing research projects directed at students or professional researchers. But between 2008 and 2014, things began to change. Posts and videos began to appear telling people not to trust the conclusions of scientific studies, but to do your own research.
You can go out and do your own research.
Do your own research.
I think you should. You should research.
They aren't suggesting you go to Greenland and start measuring ice flows or test cell phones on members of your family to see if they cause brain tumours, let alone get an education, go to university, take a PhD, start working as a researcher, and eventually get to the point where you have the freedom to do your own research. They mean that if you want to know the answer to some aspect of science, don't follow the science, because scientific research can't be trusted. Go and find the answers in blogs, videos, and podcasts, where they're sure you'll find exactly the kind of misinformation they're promoting. I mean, after all, these sources must be true, because there are people wearing white coats, and people with doctor in their name, and whatever this is, and wise quotations, and, well, Elon Musk. And here's one that shows you how to cure COVID-19 by boiling up black peppers and adding lemon juice, I suppose to make you invisible while you drink it. It must all be true, because it has the word truth right in there in some of the titles. So in this video, that's how I'm going to use the term doing your own research. because that's the way people urging you to do your own research use it. Let's take Kyrie Irving, an American basketball player, as an example. In February 2017, he announced that the world was flat. Okay, well, that's what he believes, that's fine. And he encouraged people not to simply follow the science and accept that the world was round, but to do your own research. And they did. Very soon after he spoke, in February 2017, belief in a flat Earth, in the USA at least, suddenly spiked. But this is puzzling, because if all these people did their own research and presumably Googled, "Is the Earth flat?", the first pages of answers that come up reassure them that it's not, and explain the wealth of evidence that the Earth is a sphere. Even Answers in Genesis says it's not, and they heard that from Jesus. But according to Irving, there are two sides arguing this out. Apparently it's a debate somewhere. To find the other side, you have to avoid 2,000 years of research, from the ancient Greeks to NASA, and do a deep dive into the corners of the blogosphere, where you can find stuff like this.
While the inner Earth civilization is called Agartha, and the capital city often referred to as Shambhala, whose ruler is said to have given orders to the Dalai Lama in the past, transmitted through certain secret tunnels connecting this inner world with Tibet.
Well, you've convinced me. After you've done that, the YouTube and Google algorithms will say, "Oh, you like that stuff? Okay, here's more of it." So it's not doing your own research that's the problem. It's where you go to do your research and whether you're skeptical enough to fact-check what you find there. The reason DIY researchers don't do this, well, maybe this follow-up quote from Irving gives us a clue. Apparently, these DIY researchers are going to feel and believe what they want to feel. So DIY research is about delving deeper until you come across something you want to believe in. Because this thing called truth is simply whatever you want to believe is true. Where have I heard that before?
Well, it's true for me. You see, I believe.
You mean true for you is different from true for anybody else?
Now, of course, people watching this who do their own research are going to say, "But I'm not like that. MacArthur Wheeler was an idiot, and Irving is obviously deluded. I'm better than them. I'm smart. When I do my own research, I always get to the truth." This guy, for example, thinks he's done his own research. Carefully done his research into something. Carefully done his research in depth into something as simple as which came first, the term climate change or global warming. And yet still got the answer wrong. It takes just 5 minutes to track the origin of the term climate change in the context we use it today. It comes from this 1955 paper by Gilbert Plass, which explained how fossil fuel burning is leading to increasing levels of CO2, and that will cause average global temperatures to rise, and of course change the Earth's climate. And it's also easy to track the term global warming to this 1975 paper by Wally Broecker. If someone so confident in his abilities thinks he's researched a very easy question carefully and in depth, and still gets the answer wrong, what chance do DIY researchers have when they come up against a science question that's far more challenging? So, okay, people get their information from unreliable sources, they aren't skeptical, and they don't fact-check. But that still doesn't explain why they're so supremely confident. They're more confident than even university professors who've been doing professional research their whole lives. Beginners start off knowing almost nothing about a subject compared to someone who's studied a science subject at university, gone to take a PhD, and then spent 20 years doing scientific research. So, to contrast the study time, let's be generous and give the beginner a score of 1 out of 10,000 on his knowledge. His confidence at the start is therefore going to be quite low, because he doesn't know anything. But let's say the beginners read a bit about the subject and learn a few facts, so their knowledge of that subject goes up quite a bit. Let's say to a 10. That's still only a 0.01% of what an experienced researcher would know, and barely scratches the surface of the subject. But from their perspective, their knowledge has increased 10 times. That's 1,000%. Their confidence soars. This is such a high rise in understanding that it seems to them as though they've covered everything. If some of them go on to actually study the subject properly, They soon realise there's a heap of stuff they still don't know. From euphoria and overconfidence, they fall into a sense of despair that they'll never be able to master the subject. That feeling gradually goes away the more they learn, and if they reach the stage of greatest knowledge, they once again find confidence. But it never regains the level of that beginner's bubble. Why? Well, university professors with a lifetime experience know something the beginners don't. They understand the huge scope of their subject and what we don't yet know. They're aware of the pitfalls. They've seen how easy it is to miscalculate and to make false assumptions. They constantly have peer reviewers, colleagues, and even rivals checking their results. They're cautious. They know that a scientific hypothesis can never be proved, but there are 1,000 ways it can be disproved. In the do-your-own-research world, there's no system for checking by others, correcting mistakes, or withdrawing blogs and videos that turn out to be wrong. It doesn't seem to matter. A lot of the time, these DIY researchers are getting their information from other DIY researchers. Do we have examples of that? Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
Scientists have been giving grave warnings about the Maldives for many years. In 1988, they predicted that it may be submerged in 30 years' time. Remarkably, in 2018, after this prediction had not come to pass, scientists again predicted that the Maldives could become uninhabitable in 30 years.
But the extent of academic agents' research for this claim is just a couple of newspaper articles. The only person mentioned in the first article was a Maldives government official who did not say the island would be submerged in 30 years. The other newspaper article cited a scientific study and also did not quote any scientist saying the Maldives would be submerged in 30 years. So where did the academic agent, let's call him AA, get this ridiculous idea that scientists predicted the Maldives would be submerged within 30 years? I'm guessing he only read the clickbait headline of one article and the first paragraph of the other, and then made a number of wild assumptions. If he'd read just a few lines further on, even the lines he showed on the screen, he would have seen that these predictions have nothing to do with the submergence of the Maldives. The government official in the first one reportedly said that an estimated rise of 20 to 30 centimetres would be catastrophic for most of the islands, which were less than a metre above sea level. Not because the islanders would be submerged, but because salt water would intrude into their drinking water supplies. They'd have to abandon their islands. The second article made that clear. Rising sea levels wouldn't submerge the islands in 30 years, they would contaminate their supply of fresh water, and that only applied to low-lying islands. In this case, in the Marshall Islands, but the same problem is affecting the Maldives. We can actually read what the scientists say because the Mail Online cites a study, and it just took me 2 minutes to find it, and 2 minutes more to confirm that their conclusions have been accurately reported. After I pointed out the error, academic agent was quick to blame someone else for the mistake.
I made the fatal error of saying scientists say, and apparently if you go back to the original journal article, the scientists didn't say that. So the media got it wrong.
No, sorry, you can't blame the media. They mostly got the story right. You got it wrong by believing a newspaper headline instead of reading the article, and not fact-checking everything by reading the scientific study. Then AA blamed the scientific publishing system. It's not simple laziness, he wrote to one critic. People don't have access to journals. But the study cited by the Mail Online is freely available on the internet. All I had to do was Google it, and I had no trouble downloading a copy. So yes, it is laziness. Blaming someone else for their inadequate fact-checking skills is common practice among DIY researchers. It's fascinating to see how they react when they're confronted with hard facts that show they're wrong. For example, when popular blogger Jonathan Duhamel confidently told his followers that a scientific study had just concluded that only 3% of the CO2 in the atmosphere comes from human activities, they believed him, because of course he was telling them the truth, right? When one of the authors spoke out about the way her paper was being misrepresented on the internet, Duhamel suggested the authors didn't understand their own paper, but he said he did. I took what the original paper's author said to be what she meant, he said in his blog. To Anthony Watts he wrote, "She seems to contradict what she wrote in the abstract." It didn't occur to him that his lack of any scientific training meant that maybe the authors of the paper knew something he didn't. So the lead author of the study herself wrote to Duhamel and gave him a short course in elementary school science, explaining his mistake, which was to confuse carbon gas concentration with carbon flux. Finally, the penny dropped, and Duhamel understood. But instead of blaming himself for the error, just like academic agent, he blamed a lack of access to the paper. Apart from the astonishing revelation that this meant he hadn't even read the paper, that excuse didn't hold water, because again, the paper was freely available on the internet, and a teeny bit of, research would have found it by just Googling the title. So then Duhamel blamed the authors for using scientific language he couldn't understand. I mean, really? If your best excuse for getting something wrong is that you couldn't find a paper through a simple Google search, even though you claim to understand the paper better than the authors, and then blame them for not dumbing down the science to a level that you can understand, then maybe your DIY research skills aren't as good as you thought. So the extent of most do-your-own research seems to be to seek out videos and blogs by influencers who themselves are doing their own research by making stuff up based on newspaper headlines and a belief about papers they've never read. Sorry to be rude, but any idiot can learn a bit of science or read a headline and then make up a story. It takes a little more effort to fact-check the information, which is so easy to do. But there is a different kind of DIY researcher, as this poster pointed out. This one is more literal. They actually do go out and check the work of scientists by making their own measurements.
Just there. It's gone up by about a millimetre. Got it? I've got it. 3 mil.
This guy measured the rate of sea level rise, for example, and found that measurements by scientists were way off. And he assured me he understood the effects of tides and all that. But professional oceanographers use sophisticated instruments like tide gauges and satellite altimetry. They can measure sea level to a fraction of a millimetre. What do the DIY researchers use? A machete and a bit of white paint? Okay, look, I'm being condescending. Sorry, I know, they're smarter than that. I use a machete and a bit of white paint. Some DIY researchers don't even bother with that. Apparently, they can tell the height of sea level to the nearest millimetre just by looking at it. If you're wondering where I am on this curve, well, I'm the poor woman stuck in the middle. I'm well past the stage when I thought I knew better than qualified research scientists. That was when I was 12, and I didn't believe my teachers who said scientists had split an atom. Because I'd learned that an atom was tiny, and no scalpel would be sharp enough to cut through it. The scientists were therefore talking bollocks. But as I learned more and more and went to university, I discovered there's a huge amount about the atom I still didn't know. I realized it would take years of postgraduate work to master nuclear physics, and just as much for my major, geology. But doesn't that mean I'm not qualified to make up my own scientific theories and expound them on this channel? Yes, that's precisely what it means. One critic thought he had a gotcha when he wrote, "If Potholder is saying vloggers that do your own research aren't to be trusted, that includes himself." Yes, it does. That's why I don't do my own research. Instead, I fact-check. So anytime someone talks about my theories, I'm very flattered, but I don't have any theories.
Under Potholder's feedback theory...
Not my theory, mate.
What if the effect of those orbital cycles was actually very large? Then his entire theory goes down the drain immediately.
And again, it's not my theory. A YouTuber called Tony Heller is so unfamiliar with the science that during a debate with him about the cause of glacial cycles, I had to constantly point out that these are not my theories. I'm just reporting the conclusions of scientific studies, which he clearly isn't aware of. Using phrases like follow the science just shows how biased you actually are. But this is a science channel, so of course I follow the science. People come to this channel because they want to know whether people who make up their own science are brilliant or full of cow excrement. Follow the science is what we all do in school. It's how the next generation of scientists is trained. The people who are going to invent your future 7G cell phone network, or improve yields on the food you eat, or find the oil you want to run your car. Nothing to do with bias. If we didn't follow science, we'd be back to the 13th century. And you can bet that countries like China and India are following the science. Even do-it-yourself researchers follow the science, ironically, because, remember, to kickstart the first stage of the Dønninг-Krüger effect, you have to gain a teeny bit of scientific knowledge in order to think you've learned it all. So, for example, Ben Davidson, a lawyer who's never studied geology, follows the science just far enough to learn that the world is divided into tectonic plates, and that most earthquakes happen along the boundaries of these plates. That was all the information he needed to launch his own theory about how the sun causes earthquakes. So the belief is that scientists are in on a huge conspiracy and have got everything wrong except the bit DIY researchers need to get started. Now, before